on behalf of Owen to this discussion about Britain and the United Kingdom. There's a number of crises affecting the country at the moment. The most serious one, obviously, the coronavirus, where Britain has one of the worst records in the world in terms of death. That's not gone, and things may worsen because of the new variants. There's also the Brexit issue, which hasn't really surfaced yet, the issue about jobs and trading, which is yet to hit us. And then there's the issue of the unity of the United Kingdom, the unity of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, all of which, even Wales at the moment, a little bit of a demand for more autonomy happening down there. And then you have the thing in the Channel Islands, which is a residue from Normandy, when Normandy split in 1167. The Channel Islands were left behind. There's a problem there now with regard to fishing. And for those who take an interest in such things, there's a particular crisis affecting Mrs. Luxembourg, who's sometimes known as the Queen, and her son, Harriet Luxembourg, has had some recent publicity. The real name for the family is Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Luxembourg, which represents all the territories and kingdoms across Europe, which were once part of Victoria's legacy. But nonetheless, that's also in crisis. The United Kingdom itself, Scotland joined with England in 1603 when two kingdoms came together. And James VI of Scotland came south to become James I of England. And then Scotland voluntarily became part of that unity of the two kingdoms. There's a different story in Ireland, where conquest was carried out particularly badly under Cromwell, where massacres were conducted because of the battle for the royal lineage in England between James and the rest of them, James II. Ireland paid a big price for that and was forcibly brought into the unity. Wales is a different story. The Tudors have a long history in Wales, but nonetheless, in 1284, Wales was annexed and became part of what was in the United Kingdom. Then there's the issue of the election. There'll be a lot of discussion about this, I'm sure, when the discussion opens up. But in the most recent elections, Labour lost, I think, 300 local authority seats, which is massive. They also lost the Hartlepool by-election. And then in Scotland, where once Labour was a dominant party and the Tories had really no presence at all, now we're faced with Scottish National Party majority and the demand for a referendum. We'll also have to discuss that. I'm sure the Cumers all agree that the Scottish people have a right themselves to decide whether or not or how they want to be, how they want to conduct their affairs. They have the right to have a referendum, the right to decide. It's a different argument as to which argument you might support in the independence campaign, but to have a right to have that decision left to themselves. I was thinking also about Corbyn. We need to have a discussion also, and I'm sure this will be continued when the thing opens up. But there's a lot of sentimentality around that issue, and I'm sure John Dunn, no better man, will sort that out and make it realistic in people's consciousness. It's a bit like, it reminds me a bit of the World Cup in 1966, which England won. Kind of past glories. Everybody looking back to Corbyn's past glories. I mean, England might win the next World Cup. In fact, I'll have a few bob on them myself. But you can't live off past glories, and that's a bit, I think, a bit of what's happening with Corbyn at the moment. It's also worth reminding ourselves that there have been 11 Labour Prime Ministers, not 11 Prime Ministers, 11 Labour governments in England, going back to the 1920s. And we still haven't resolved the social crisis in England, problems about jobs, unemployment, public welfare, social affairs, and so on. After all these Labour governments, we've had 6 Prime Ministers. The worst of them, of course, in the recent times, being Blair. He's an article now in the New Statesman recently where he's calling on Starmer to move further to the right in order to increase Labour's vote. And the betrayals by Blair have all happened in the past as well. I mean, Harold Wilson, back in the 60s, tried to introduce legislation to restrict trade union actions. In place of strife was a white paper, which Barbara Castle brought forward. It was defeated before it even hit the statute books by the activity of the trade union movement mobilising against them. So there's a long history there. And Gateskill back in the 50s tried to get rid of the clause about nationalisation of production, distribution and exchange. He failed in that by voting the Labour Party. But Blair succeeded in the 90s in taking that clause out of the Constitution. And the party's gone downhill since Blair's time. His particular failure with the war in Iraq was a disgrace. where he brought all this false information forward about the weapons of mass destruction in order to develop his support for Bush. Now, these are some of the issues that will, I'm sure, come forward in the discussion. Our speaker tonight, our opening speaker, is John Dunn, a veteran of the great miners' strike of the 1980s. And after John has finished his opening contribution, which won't be that long, I believe, John has told us, so he's free to speak as long as he wishes, but he says he won't talk for very long. And then Cormac then can speak on any topic they wish of relevance to the discussion of Britain and the United Kingdom. So over to you, John.
Thank you, Finn. Finn's actually done a far better job of the introduction than I have, and that I can possibly do. This is not a lead-off. I want to make that clear. I think on issues like this, open-ended discussions, so I just want to make a few points. I particularly want to make a few points about where I think that over at least my history, this, you know, as Marxists, we've got it wrong, and where, you know, we've followed false gods and chased false images. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is British perspectives. To be honest, I shrink in horror sometimes when I hear that phrase. I remember my time in militant, and more lately in the IMT, where publishing British perspectives meant that you would publish this trait full of quotes from people from Ted Grant to Lenin to Marx to Trotsky. And if just one point came right, then that meant that whoever had written it had been conferred some sort of godlike status, and that it proved that we were on the way to be the vanguard, to be the leader of the organised working class. And to be honest, to use working class phrases, I think that whole approach was a load of bollocks. Because why did militant fail? Why have the so-called revolutionary left never been able to gain a real foothold inside the British working class? And I think we have to look at the reality, and the reality, the sort of things that Finn opened up on, the reality of Brexit, particularly the election losses of Labour and this falling of the so-called Red Wall, which is a phrase I absolutely abhor and detest. You know, that goes back to the days when Labour took places, and I come from Red Wall so-called areas, and there's never been such a thing. There were places where there were highly organised working class communities around mines and around manufacturing industry. And the whole history of the Labour Party and those communities has been one of betrayal and ultimately abandonment. Finn talked about the Wilson years. I remember my dad in 3 short years having to work at 4 different pits because Harold Wilson, during his government, closed 300 mines because we were going to meet the white hot heat of technology, and that was going to provide jobs, wealth, and we're all going to bask in this white hot heat of technology. Now, unfortunately for Danesmore, Claycross, where I come from, we didn't even see a single spark of that white hot heat of technology. So is it any wonder that when Labour under Corbyn talked about the green industrial revolution, nobody in former mining areas took it serious? Under successive Labour leaderships, all these communities got was the likes of Ed Miliband being foisted upon them, Caroline Flint, and all the dead wood that now is floating back to the top of the Labour Party. And so I think we're in a unique situation now. Since I was on strike some 37 years ago. We've seen a halving of trade union membership. We've seen trade unions themselves become, where they do exist, become a former shadow of themselves, selling insurance and giving out diaries instead of being fighting organisations. And the left was left in some respects to rely upon this new messiah called Jeremy Corbyn. And you know, Finn has pointed out where that got us. Corbyn, as sincere and as principled as he was, offered no answer, and he wasn't even acceptable to his own MPs. But unfortunately, I think in today's left, and this is what I want to concentrate on just for a few minutes as an opening, today's left think that's all that matters. I went into a DIY shop recently, and a manager was berating the young lad on the checkout about not doing something. He was talking to him as if he was an animal. And I told this manager that you never ever talk to anybody like that while I'm in your premises. And I said to the lad, "Are you in a trade union?" And his answer was, "What's one of them?" Nobody's heard of a trade union in that workplace. And I think that sums up how the union movement have failed over the years. And in recent years, we've seen that genuine activists inside trade unions have been holding a rearguard battle and fighting, you know, to keep workplace rights, to keep wages at a decent level, and to protect their living standards, and gradually being pushed back with no assistance from trade union leaders. We've got good trade union leaders in a few. Len McCluskey is a good left. But while he has been singing the praises of Jeremy Corbyn and defending Jeremy Corbyn, he's lost 1 million members from Unite over the last few years, last 3 or 4 years. And that's an indictment of these left union leaders. So where do we go as a movement? I think that we have to accept that politics in some respects has changed, especially in terms of the Labour Party, that I now think is a bust flush, has become irrelevant. The Bakers Union, only a small union, but probably the most fighting union in Britain at the moment, recently did a survey of its members, and only 9% thought the Labour Party was of any relevance to their needs. And in fact, Labour Party politics, there's some great socialists, don't get me wrong, I am not knocking them, but it's become dominated with the demise of industrial workplaces by a sort of middle class layer. People who are more interested in isms and single issue things. People who thought, again, no disrespect to them, but thought that all we had to do during the Corbyn leadership is sing "Oh Jeremy Corbyn," and that was it. There was no sense, and Corbyn himself was at fault over bringing together his mass membership and organising them into some fighting organisations. And that, I think, has left the working class as we know it isolated from politics. We've seen it, that gradually over years, the working class vote for Labour has been falling and falling. And ultimately, obviously exacerbated by the Brexit issue, where the bulk of industrial communities voted for Brexit, not because they're racist, not because they're backward, because they looked around and saw the mine had gone, the factory had gone, the local shops had closed, the doctor's surgery had gone, the Labour Council had closed their library, and looked around and thought, if this is what life's like in the EU, we might as well give something else an opportunity. And for that, the middle class left called them racist, fascist, Tommy Robinson supporters, and again created that divide. Now, what do we do? And I'm gonna finish on this because, as I say, I'm trying to provoke a discussion. As Marxists, for too long, I think we've acted as soothsayers. We've seen signs everywhere. I remember Alan Woods telling us in the IMT that the death of Princess Diana and the people throwing flowers outside Buckingham Palace and mass mourning for Lady Diana was a sign of coming revolution. That's the nonsense that was talked about that. And I think we have to, in some respects, shed the old skins of what we got in the CWI, the IMT, and others, and turn back to grassroots activity. We've seen in this past weekend what grassroots activity can achieve in Glasgow, where the deportation of 2 asylum seekers was stopped by a mass community movement organised spontaneously over mobile phones, where thousands of people beat back the police and prevented these 2 asylum seekers being taken to a holding centre and ultimately deported. So there is an opportunity for us to be part of campaigns, but I don't think we can do it in the way that we used to. I think that in militant, in the Socialist Party, we acted as evangelists. We have got the message. We are here. We are going to teach you how to be like us, that we are going to build a vanguard because we've read a few books. Now, I've read the Kama Sutra, but I can't perform any sexual gymnastics, I can promise you. And my partners are grinning at that and would be living proof of it. But I think I use that as an example because we've followed a wrong model. Instead of getting, and I know that we've got great activists, but the organisations we held to weren't organisations really that got their hands dirty, especially in the latter days of my involvement. And now we have the IMT as a purely student body. The SP are more interested in splitting votes and allowing right-wing trade union leaders come to the fore. So what do? I think with some humility, we take our place in the movement and we do what we always have done and what we always should do as individuals, but we don't do it. We don't turn up to a picket line because there are going to be some contacts there that we can recruit. We turn up to a picket line because workers are in struggle and deserve our support. And we earn our spurs. We win people to our ideas by being part of that movement. And I hope we can have a decent discussion about what we do in Britain and possibly throughout the world, because you can't discuss British perspectives without discussing what's happening in throughout the world. So, comrades, I've enjoyed what I've had to say. I hope I've not offended anybody too much with what I've said, but if I have, it's tough shit, because my experiences since being on strike, since going through a few organisations, but always being part of my class, warts and all, has taught me that we have been looking in the wrong direction and that we have to change. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, John. It's a very valuable opening contribution. Raises lots of interesting ideas. We should use this discussion to develop arguments, not just to make contributions abstractly, but to develop the arguments and to argue the thing through to conclusion. For example, the points that John raised about the collapse of trade union membership, that needs to be looked at. The question of the left and the Labour Party. I mean, I had the experience, like a lot of comrades, of watching the campaign group of MPs last Wednesday, and it was a total disappointment and letdown. the points that John raises about Corbyn need to be gone into. There'll be different opinions on that. We need to examine the different issues there. So this is a point, this is an opportunity to develop the arguments and to try and find some way forward out of the morass that we're in at the moment. So, and incidentally, comrades can speak in and out in the discussion if they want to develop the points further. It's not limited to just one contribution and one issue and end the story. We're trying to find answers to the questions that John has posed here in front of us. So, the next comrade now.
Yeah, I agree with lots of the points that John has thrown up. It was interesting this weekend, yesterday. You know, we've seen thousands of people out on the street protesting over Palestine. In Liverpool, we had a really lively demonstration that was, you know, the activists were there, but it was basically the young people and very noticeably young women who led the march, didn't do all the speaking, did a lot of the speaking, and then when the march had finished, they decided to march back again through town, and they actually kept it up for another 2 rounds of the original march. And we've also seen the young people turn out over Kill the Bill, and we saw many people turn out in London over the protest of the murder of the young woman Sarah by the police, and then beating up the people who came out on the vigil. So there are sort of sections out there that aren't necessarily, you know, involved in the movement traditionally. But it's also kind of, where are these people going to go? I was listening to one of the recordings, and there was a discussion about social democracy, and, you know, capitalism doesn't want even the most basic reforms and doesn't want to pay for the basics like the welfare state. And we've seen under cover of COVID that basically the trade unions, most of the MPs, councillors have been trapped like rabbits in the COVID headlight, with few exceptions, while the Tories have actually been busy seriously trying to dismantle the NHS behind the scenes. And that movement to try and to build a movement from below and to stop the Americanisation, you know, the complete Americanisation of the NHS, you know, we have a role to play in building mass campaigns around that. But there's no guarantee that we can succeed, because, you know, many of these leaders haven't even noticed this is going on, including in the health unions. I mean, there could be strikes of nurses, and the Royal College of Nurses are talking action. But again, you know, let's just see what they actually organise. But just a couple of questions really I'd like to raise is, a number of these campaigns could soak up some of the disillusioned Labour Party members, and could soak up some of the new people coming in to struggle. But at the moment, I mean, in Wavertree, they've just passed a motion of no confidence in Starmer. But between a quarter and a third of their members have left since Starmer was elected. And obviously there are, as John said, there's people there who were just pinned all their hopes on Corbyn. But it's kind of what's going to happen, and what can we do with the good people who are there. And interestingly, in the elections, you know, we've had all this publicity about corruption in Liverpool. We've had election for the imposed candidate for mayor, and the independent, who's basically non-political, came second and got, you know, quite a few votes, so much higher than all the rest put together. But the big winners in a lot of these elections up and down the country were the, you know, abstainers. And you know, there is this issue about what are people going to do, you know, in the Labour Party or not in the Labour Party. Personally, I think there's very little chance of Corbyn getting reinstated. John, I was at a meeting the other day where John McDonnell was speaking, and he said, you know, there's no way they're leaving. And although they put out an alternative Queen speech, you know, on paper it's not bad, but it's in terms of organising a fight and organising people in campaigns, you know, not just about votes and not just about fighting the witch hunt in the Labour Party, important as that might be. So I'd just be interested in any views as well, if people think that Corbyn's peace and justice movement is going anywhere. I mean, personally, I feel that's a bit of a dodge of what to do about the Labour Party, but I have no experience about how that's gone. But anyway, meantime, certainly for us in England, I think the fight for the NHS could be really a key fight in helping mobilise and fighting even if we don't win. Thanks.
Thank you, Leslie. Very valuable points there, and some new issues to look at. The Palestinian issue has mobilised lots of people in many cities. There's a big march in Dublin yesterday. That might be a way for people previously inactive to become active. And also the NHS is a huge issue in England and has developed a new momentum now with the big pharma companies making a fortune out of the COVID-19 crisis. So the issue of the NHS is now linked to the question of public ownership of the big pharma companies as well. So anyway, thank you, Leslie. Matthew, you're next, followed then by Dominic.
Hi, comrades. So just give us a big subject. I think I'm probably. I mean, I have a background in Trotskyist organisations, but obviously not the militants. Comrades slightly differently to most of you comrades. And I think it's one of these things, and I think it's a question of actually debating through that, that whole sort of legacy, and so where did it work, where did it not work, and what were the issues, and how was it capable of actually producing a politics which could comprehend the situation. And I think from what John's saying, and I generally agree with him, the answer to the question, could it understand what was going on, is no, for some important reasons. But it's then to say, I think that even going beyond that, I mean, the issue that I think is critical is that, the left does have to present to the working class an alternative. I mean, it's not enough just to say we'll be the best campaigners for this campaign and that campaign and the rest of it. I think the important thing is that we have to actually say, look, we are the best campaigners. We will take these fights forward, but we're standing here in order to, because we have an alternative to these people. We're not here just to get a bit of this and a bit of that. We're actually here to get rid of the whole system. That's really critical, to say, okay, well, actually what you need, above all, is the end of capitalism. Because, clearly, obviously, in any examination, the thing is completely rotten and in fact falling apart. And the ruling class itself becomes, as we can see, illustrated by the COVID thing, in which, of course, a handful of billionaires actually pumped a whole lot of money from the mass of the population into their own pockets. Jeff Bezos increased his total wealth, I think, by certainly 50%, if not more. There are dozens of others who are similar to him, and that's what they've done with this situation, is to enrich themselves in the conditions in which most people are in crisis, is to say, okay, well, we won't neglect that crisis, we'll actually make us, suck more out of the population of the world. And our response has to be, well, look, we can't afford you. We actually need rid of you, and we need rid of your system. The other question is also, as you say, is to understand that system. And I think the problem is that, if you look at the sort of history of the left, is it didn't really understand that system, and it didn't understand what was going on. The import of, really, in Britain, of course, is the decline of capitalism and the particular effect of that decline on Britain as the oldest capitalist country. And if you look at what Thatcher did, which was, of course, to deindustrialize much of the country, and and to move from a relatively a manufacturing base towards the removal of much of that base, and the move to finance capital. You could then you begin to understand what was actually going on. And the thing is, that decision, we can date that decision, because it's really the abandonment of the Bretton Woods system at the beginning of the 70s, under the impact of both the Vietnam War, plus, of course, the insurgent working class in the late 60s and early 70s. And it's the finance, they go towards finance capital, and they say, okay, we'll abandon all this stuff. And actually what you get, of course, is that manufacturing in Britain is now less of a share of the economy than I think virtually any other country in the world, certainly less than the US, which of course is the hegemon, so, okay, well, but Britain is the oldest country, is the oldest capitalist country. So the whole event goes further in those terms. And it's it's that decline, and at the same time, as he says, it's as John says, it's to try and shatter the organisations of the working class and break down, the fact that you've had these organisations which have been built on industry over generations in many cases, but they can then dispose of this and atomise the working class, which is what they've done, and the political effect of that, I mean, if we look at, the Labour Party, obviously we can see at the same time, I think you're also looking at the situation, the impact of the end of Stalinism. And Stalinism itself, as a system, obviously props up the social democratic parties, such as the Labour Party, and it's the end of Stalinism in the early 90s then allows the likes of Blair to say, well, okay, we're not bothering with this Labour stuff. We're just capitalist politicians, I mean, Blair basically funded the organisation off the back of his mates, Lord Cashpoint and so on and so forth. So, as somebody remarks, the Labour Party is now the party during Blair's time, the Labour party of big business, Tory party of small business, So it's a shift. The thing is, obviously, then you get the response of Corbyn, and I think Corbyn's quite peculiar, because obviously, if you look at what happens in the rest of Europe, you get different organisations arise. I mean, again, with major political difficulties and so on and so forth, but you start to get political organisations outside of the traditional social democratic parties. And what happens, of course, is if you look at France, I mean, the PS in France is now effectively gone. Italy, the PSI is gone after Craxi actually in the 80s. The SPD is now down at 15% and looking likely to actually fall on its face. And you can go through a whole series of countries in which very significant social democratic parties are disintegrating. Because basically, they obviously, as reformist organisations, they can't offer anything because the ruling class, clearly as we see, so we're not giving any reforms. No chance you having any reforms. The only reforms we're interested in is sucking more money out of the working class, making ourselves richer and squeezing down on the working class and its, of course, its democratic rights and organisations and all the rest of it. That's what they're doing, because it's essentially a rapacious system. Causes itself its own problems, but Corbyn is peculiar in that obviously the problem is that the British left itself is of course so shattered and by that whole process, and of course it's various opportunities. And the thing is, the British left has had a series of opportunities to do various things. I mean, if you take, for example, the Scottish Socialist Party, which I was a member of, and other things, the British left has had a whole series of opportunities, and it's basically wasted a lot of them. So it's got no credibility in front of the working class for obvious reasons. Why would it have? Every time it gets a chance, it generally pisses it up against the wall. So the thing is, then of course, people are looking around for some kind of alternative some kind of means of striking back against the system under the conditions, obviously, we have harsh austerity from 2008 and so on. And so you arrive at Corbyn. Now, I mean, I agree with comments. I don't think Corbyn is particularly, capable. Corbyn, McDonnell, etc., clearly not capable of actually taking on the capitalists at all. And every time there was an attack, they backed down, and that was before any chance of them getting into government. If they got into government, they would have run away basically, and we would have wound up in the same situation, of the imposition of austerity. There's no question of that. But the core question really is for us and for the working class is, okay, what kind of organisations do you need? Because we can say, as John has said, I mean, while Len McCluskey has done some posturing and so on and so forth, and other union leaders have said whatever and whatever and whatever, they have not actually inflicted a single blow upon the employers. In fact, what they've done, and in fact, what the trade union bureaucracy has done, is facilitated the attacks of the employers on the workers. So, I mean, the fact that workers then turn around and say, well, we're not really, that's bothered about unions, or in fact hostile to unions. I mean, this is the thing, is, if you speak to people like Paul Holmes, he says, well, the problem he has as an organiser is he constantly comes across people who've been sold out by the unions and they won't touch them. I mean, who can blame them? Really, seriously. The question is, okay, really, how do you build organisations who's actually capable of fighting the capitalist class? And then secondly, in terms of, politics, it's a repoliticisation of the unions, and then an analysis of what is actually going on and what we require. So I'm sorry for taking up time, but I thought those are the key points.
Okay. Thank you, Matthew, particularly for highlighting the points about the need to overthrow the capitalist system and to link that overthrow to the programme that we advance. And thank you also for raising the question of the international nature of this betrayal by Social Democrats, which is an important issue to look at. I don't like interrupting comrades, so I'm sorry about that, Matthew. Your points were valuable points, but to give other comrades a chance. The next speaker, I don't know if it's Dominic or John. Dominic, I think, and then followed by John Ryman.
John, I just want to reiterate some of the points that John Dunn made. After the miners' strike, obviously I think in mining areas, there was a lot of demoralisation, because not only was it a defeat of the strike as such, but in reality it was a stab in the back by the labour and trade union leadership. But speaking from my experiences in Manchester, big cities I don't think were affected in the same way as the pit villages. And there were two things that happened after the miners' strike that, to my money, really showed up, if you like, the inadequacies of the leadership of Militant, which I was involved in. The first one was there was a big movement of school students. Now, at that time, I was a councillor in Manchester, and this was taken up by the organisation that we should be working to build a school student organisation. Now, I was able to get from the leadership of the council full backing for the activities of the school student union, and they were involved in sometimes in strikes, etc. They had a set of demands. I was given a carte blanche to book rooms in the town hall for meetings, book printing facilities in the town hall for publicity that would go out in the name of the School Students' Union. And to be quite honest with you, that particular effort was, as far as Militant was concerned, fell on deaf ears. Unless Militant could control it, it wasn't worth bothering with. That was the experience we had in Manchester. And there was a real movement of school students. There were strikes on when sixth form colleges were threatened with closure. Thousands of students were out on the streets. You know, there was a real vibrant movement. But all that you got was, we need to recruit. We need more comrades. Well, to be honest with you, that wasn't on at that time. You had to show to the school students that you were a serious person, following their ideas, following, if you like, their demands, which were by and large demands that we would fully support. And that came to nothing. The second thing was the poll tax, which was a massive movement and involved literally tens of thousands of people in an active manner. Throughout Britain, I think you had a situation of something like 18 million people refusing to pay the poll tax. In many working class areas, nearly every window in the streets had a anti-poll tax leaflet in that. And again, when it came to the end of the poll tax, all that we got was the need to build the organisation, not to try and harness any community activity around things like debt, around things like bailiffs. You know, and it really annoyed me that there have been real opportunities. And there is a saying that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and we should listen. And that's what was the real failures at that time, was we were not listening, we were preaching. And quite frankly, we were preaching a message that a lot of people either weren't interested in or didn't understand. And that is why I think now with Win and the sort of orientation we have is really worthwhile, of listening to people. Many people who have spoken at Win meetings have illusions in people like Lula in Brazil. And, you know, because in Brazil, they're faced with an absolute maniac of a prime minister, Bolsonaro, who, as somebody described him, he was Donald Trump on steroids. You know, and from that point of view, it is a matter of listening to people, understanding where they're coming from and winning them over to the ideas of Marxism, not in a rhetorical preaching manner. And, you know, I just wanted to say that I think John said at the beginning that he hoped he wouldn't upset too many people. Well, as far as I'm concerned, what John said was, you know, the height of moderation. You know, he didn't say anything that I could take offence at. So I'll leave it at that.
There's important lessons about how to organise and how to build opposition. And maybe comrades, when they're speaking, could bear in mind, we need to have a look at how the left is going to be built. What's going to happen in the Labour Party and outside the Labour Party, and also in the trade unions. So what's comrades' experiences in that regard? We need to look at that question in a bit of detail. Now, our next speaker is John Ryman, followed by Aman, followed by Felicity. Okay, John Ryman. Are you here, John? He's not here for the moment. We'll come back to John. So we'll take Aman next, and I'll come back to John then. Aman?
Thanks very much. It's just a very, very brief comment on this. There are a range of issues, as you mentioned, but there are big issues as well, which I think probably needs answering. I'm not saying that answers have not been provided by everyone or in different places, but in terms of the generality of it all, issues like, for example, the role of at the moment, the unions as part of the whole system, recognition that is it the general picture that is coming out is that a lot of left is literally following or hoping for part of Labour Party suddenly to change, rather than actually thinking about how the working class could be organised differently or much more in a way that it would actually challenge the whole system. So questions that I have is this, how or what needs to be done in order to make sure that the working class does achieve its own party? What are the issues? What are the key issues that needs to be addressed in order to make sure that that becomes possibility? Given the current situation, there seems to be a lot of issues. There are issues that people are talking about, and I've heard it as well, in terms of social democracy being an answer here and there, as was mentioned, like the issue of Brazil, Parliament, for example, providing an answer in terms of Labour Party, or the issue from the point of view of literally, even that is being voiced in many quarters, you hear it, that there is no such working class at the moment in the UK because the format of it is different. There are a number of issues. I'm not saying that these are all of the points, but my question is, what are the key 3, 4, 5, 10 points that it needs to be tackled in order for the working class in the Britain to be able to actually have its own party?
Okay, Felicity, we'll take you next.
Thank you, comrades. I'm probably more blunt and pessimistic than John is on one level. We are, as a working class in Britain, losing virtually all the gains that we made in the post-war period and in the fights in the 70s. But there isn't a passivity in the working class. People are ready for a fight. Not a big punch up immediately, but they want something to do to actually improve it. Now, it's been hard during the pandemic because we haven't been able to get out on the streets and talk to people. But we can now. And the first stall I did in the street last week was really interesting. The mood of people was really interesting. You didn't have time to stop for people coming up to you asking for information or asking what they could do to help. Now that was a campaign to save the NHS. I hope comrades have read the material that's going around. If they haven't, please let me know. We'll send it out about exactly what's happening to the National Health Service. But don't expect to be able to get treatment from the NHS in the way you used to do. The queues are going to be forever, and you're not likely to have qualified staff, and you're not likely to have regulated staff, and you're not, and the whole setup is being handed over to the big US corporations. But there's no lack of willingness to do something about it from ordinary people. I'm more than happy to do something about it if you give them the chance to do so. We had Leslie and I organised a local meeting in Merseyside and Cheshire and had 96 people at it, and more people who'd wanted to come. We've had, since that time, we've had every one of those people basically working on the topic and feeding back. We got a huge donation of cash from the trade unions to make it work. There are people out there who want to do something about it. Now, they don't particularly at this moment. Some of them want to discuss the nature of a class of an organisation that could allow us to get rid of capitalism. But at the moment, they want to make sure they can get their knees or their hips or their ears done. And that the next wave of the pandemic is handled better than this last two waves. But it's true also of a whole number of other campaigns. Now, as you know, Leslie, Jim and me are in Left Unity, and Left Unity is a small party which is committed to overturning capitalism. But it's not a democratic centralist organisation. It's not one where one set of people have got all the answers. It's a democratic organisation where people discuss. So I think I'd basically say is, the working class is not well organised at the moment, but every person who's in Britain here could do something to begin to build a response. And, I personally think the response will come in fighting for the NHS. We might get snotted, but we're not going to do it without a fight back. And the fight back, will come. And I'm more than happy to, oh God, we've got so many people wanting to help at the moment. It's organising the people almost that's the problem. But we want, we're more than happy to help in any of the other areas to get that sorted, get it started. But it really is an important one. And it stops you being miserable and fed up when you've actually got a lot to do with a lot of people. Thank you. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Felicity. Thanks for highlighting again the significance of the NHS and particularly your own work in Liverpool and nationally on that issue. It's obviously a central question in the campaigns in England. Our next speaker is Roger, followed by David Hempson. And if anybody knows anything about John Ryman, let me know. He seems to have left the meeting. But anyway, Roger, followed by David Hampson.
Okay, thanks, comrade. I missed a little bit of the discussion because my computer went on the blink, and I've come on again using the phone. But of course, I heard all of John's opening, and I think it was a very, as was to be expected, a very refreshing and challenging and provocative opening. And I think mostly, I think that John is right. I do want to emphasise that I hope that comrades will agree with me that Wynne does not approach these tasks in the same way as Militant or the Socialist Party or any of the other, to be honest, self-appointed vanguard parties at the time. We do not consider ourselves. We always, from the beginning, emphasised we don't call ourselves a vanguard. We call ourselves a network, and we're genuinely a network. And I think this meeting already has shown how we are open to genuine debate. The mistake of the old left, and of course, most of us come from the tradition of militant and its various offshoots. The mistake of the old left is that they are living in a complete and utter time warp. It was not wrong at one time to talk about vanguards and mobilizing the vanguard and mobilizing the masses, because the task now is not to lead the mass ranks of workers. We don't have mass ranks of workers before. Before we had people in mass socialist parties around the world. I'm talking about mass socialist parties, mass labour parties, mass communist parties, mass internationals. Millions of people organised as part of socialist or communist international. The task now is to rebuild the movement in the completely new conditions that exist since then. The era of mass parties, internationals, the era in Britain even of mass factory gate meetings, they're gone. I remember in the 1960s and the 70s, the general conception was that the most powerful force in the country were the trade unions. If you remember, in 1970, Edward Heath called an election to say who has the power in this country, who is in power, the government or the trade unions, and he lost. And we got a Labour government, and we got in the even before that, in the previous Labour government, in the 60s and in the 70s, sections of the ruling class were actually plotting military coups because they felt that the power was slipping out of their hands. Now that, of course, has completely changed now. The working class has completely changed, and so has the capitalist class. We don't have the old industrial proletariat. John Dunn is a perfect example of that in his life, as a militant striking coal miner in the past. And he's very much adjusted to the completely new situation and environment in which he finds himself now. But the capitalist class has also completely changed in Britain. And I do want to, because we're talking about Britain and not only about the tasks of that face us day by day, I want to make a point about that there's a myth that unlike the rude, uncouth French and the Russians and so on, that Britain has a tradition of moderation, reason, compromise and so on. The truth, of course, is that England has a long militant history of revolution, from the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when the king was besieged by an angry mob and barely escaped with his life. Of course, England was the first country in the world to chop the head off a king. That's 150 years before the French did the same thing. And of course, to wage a bloody civil war to overthrow what was then the ruling class. And even throughout the first half of the 19th century, Britain was constantly ablaze and teetering on the verge of revolution. Britain, of course, was the birthplace of the first workers' movement in the world, the Chartists. In the 19th century also, of course, and it's part of the same, it's the other side of the same coin, Britain was called the workshop of the world, and the British ruling class boasted of an empire on which the sun never set. And as Trotsky said, in those days, they were real strategists. They really were able to plan, not for years or decades, but even for centuries ahead. Now, look at the difference. Of course, the empire has gone, industry has gone, and so has the strategic leadership that went with it. Policies now are literally improvised on the spot. Take a very relevant example. Cameron hadn't intended to leave the EU. This is only 5 years ago when he was prime minister. The referendum was a hastily improvised delaying tactic, which he dreamed up in order to avoid a split. And when he lost, the very next day he resigned and became, as we see, a lobbyist for a scam finance company. Nothing more clearly exposes the moral decay, if you like, of British capitalism. Now, before even Cameron's day, Thatcher had deliberately destroyed what was left of Britain's industrial base in the 1980s out of fear of the proven power of the trade unions. For the industrial capitalists, the EU had offered a huge home market and a constant source of cheap labour. And so that's why it suited them, for all the chauvinistic claptrap that surrounds them culturally and so on, it suited them to remain in the EU. But of course, the industrial capitalists were no longer the dominant faction of the ruling class in Britain. Now it was the city bankers and stockbrokers who ruled. That's under Thatcher. But even the traditional city bankers and stockbrokers had prospered from being the financial centre of Europe. But they too now, in their turn, have been displaced as the top faction in the establishment. Johnson represents the speculators and hedge fund managers who've risen to the top, and they're really nothing more than crooks. The Tory party itself was ruthlessly purged of the relics of the old capitalist establishments, the Clarks and the Heseltines and so on. So that means that there's also no longer any rational base for the British nation state. It's in that context that Scotland is heading for secession, Northern Ireland for unification with Ireland. And not only is Great Britain now obsolete, so is the so-called United Kingdom. It's an incongruous anomaly now. Once the current sovereign is gone, the collapse of the monarchy itself is just a matter of time. It just remains a ritual historical pageant whose days are numbered. And so we're in a situation now which is absolutely could not be more different from the age in which the old left still think they're living. It's a fragmented money laundering, offshore islands, tax haven. It's really little more than a refuge for Russian mafia gangsters, and its properties are a receptacle for the black money of the world's corrupt oligarchs. It's sinking into the status of an offshore island off the European mainland, like, soon to be perhaps a tourist spot for Chinese sightseers, visiting ancient relics like the Tower of London and Shakespeare's birthplace, and perhaps also taking in the whiskey stills of neighbouring Scotland in a double bill. It's a bit, you could take the analogy of Spain. Spain too, over the centuries, lost an empire. It slowly decayed and disintegrated, and it ended up in civil war and famine. So the old veneer of consensus by which a liberal wing of the Tories used to rule has gone forever. But meanwhile, also the old industrial proletariat with its militant trade union traditions has been eroded. In its place, we get a new, almost pauperized working class, scraping a precarious existence on 0 hours contracts. But the important thing is that every generation learns the lessons anew. They're fast learning the lessons. We get now strikes of taxi drivers, fast food workers, office cleaners, etc. And if you like, at the other end of the spectrum, equally of former middle-class professionals like teachers, university lecturers, and hospital doctors joining the struggle. New clear battle lines have been drawn. In this situation, Of course, to live in the old time warp is complete suicide. There is no future, as John has made very graphically clear. There is no future for the old methods, for the old attitude stock of we are the militants and the vast armies of the working class. We're going to lead them, and they're going to. I mean, the point is we have to rebuild the movement. It's not a question of leading anything. It's a question of rebuilding the movement itself. But what's important is in Britain, as on a worldwide scale, that in some ways the task is so much easier. I would say that now there are no illusions left in capitalism, or very few lingering illusions. No illusions, or only few lingering illusions left in reformism either. What is holding people back from revolution now is not illusions, not the idea which used to be common in the 60s, say, or the 70s, that we will, by gradual reforms, gradually we will get more and more power and more alleviating the problems of the past. Now it's not a question of any illusions in reformism. There's only an awe at the enormity of the task of overthrowing this hugely powerful capitalist class which has got the world in its grip. But there is a worldwide wave. And I mean, I do think that Win has got its finger on the pulse in a way that none of the left groups have, in the sense that we're part of building an international, worldwide network where we genuinely discuss ideas and genuinely learn from each other's experiences. And I think that is the context in which we should place this discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Roger, for explaining the changing nature of British capitalism, and also for reminding us of the traditions, the great traditions of the British labour movement, going back to the Chartists, the Tall Puddle Martyrs, the 1945 government.
Well, look, I think it's a very good discussion, and there's some quite sharp edges in the debate, as there should be. I want to start with a question which we've discussed from one end and maybe raise it from another. It's been mentioned extensively that manufacturing in Britain has gone. And that is a general truism, although, I don't think it's gone completely, but just I think that's a truism. Now that means that, as we've explained in our perspective previously and quite exhaustively, there's been a real structural change in the British working class. And that has very important political implications. John has explained the breakup of the old traditional working class communities and the way in which, there have been betrayal after betrayal, and all of that has results. I mean, the figures are useful. I don't want to mention too many facts or figures because it's difficult sometimes to see them, to absorb them. But the basic point from the figures that I've seen is that the working class, the manual working class, the people that we normally think of as working people, has declined quite drastically in Britain, from 14.4 million to 10 million in the most recent period. And during that period, the Tories have actually won a majority. I mean, this is an astonishing fact if it's true, and it does seem to be true, that in the past, the Labour actually had a majority among the working class, the manual working class, and now it gets something like 4.5 million votes from this section, and the Tories get some 6 million votes. Now, it's indisputable in the fact that this is taking place, because how on earth are the Tories winning in areas which were previously working class? Well, the fact has to be that those people have voted, they've not abstained, they're not voting for other left groups, they're voting for the Tories. It's a terrible fact, but there it is. Now, what's happened meanwhile in the middle class, well, let's put it, the white collar workers and people like many of us who are teachers and who work in research or some field like that, is that this has grown enormously. So that now we see in Britain something like 14.3 million people are in this middle class. It's a gain of about 5 million over the last 25 years. And Labour has actually at times got the majority of the white collar workers. And now the Tories only have a slim majority in that sphere. And, you know, this points to some deeper movements which are taking place in the class, and it has very important political implications. If I could just mention, you know, everywhere in the West, it's assumed, and it's also happening in China and even in the third world, there's an uptick in life expectancy. This is the most solid social fact of our whole period for the last 100 years, is that life expectancy is continuing, and that people generally have something better of a life than they had from their parents. Now that's beginning to change, but let me just mention a fact from my own family. My father could not afford his football shoes. He couldn't afford to play. He was so humiliated by the fact that he couldn't get his boots that he never played football. He never played football with me. But he did study. I don't know how he graduated high school, but he studied by correspondence course, and then he became a quantity surveyor. And then he worked for the GLC. And that was the biggest fillip in his life. It actually gave him a whole break. And then he moved to South Africa during the war. Now he was very skeptical that I should even think of a university education, but I'd been lucky enough to have had a year in America, and I knew that most American people, the youth at least, aspired to go.
You've been cut off there, David. There's something wrong with the connection.
But anyway, there has been this long-term uptick that people can feel up till now that life could get better generation by generation. Things could certainly improve, and that the prospects for the children would be better. But now that's not the case. But as this is becoming clear, we see less class organization, less class consciousness, and the most open expression. And if you look at the social attitude surveys of Britain, we see that there's something of a backlash against all the changes which have been taking place over the last few decades. That's been one of the bases on which we've had a faith in the future, even when there have been setbacks, is that society is morphing, it's changing, it's evolving, so that gays are now tolerated. Women, it's expected that you should expect your daughters to be able to have the same education as your sons, and that slowly society is evolving, even if not capitalism is evolving, our social attitudes are making a change in society. And now that's been threatened by Brexit. And I have to say this to John, you know, when I was in I went to the British Library, you know, the last time I was in Britain, and I ended up chatting to a Polish woman, and she was distraught, and I asked her what was wrong. And she felt that her whole life had gone upside down. She was terrified. She says, I don't like British people, they're ugly, and I'm humiliated, and I just want to leave now. Now, that's it was a horrible thing. I never, you know, I found it difficult to understand, and I've kept in touch with her. And eventually she has gone back, you know, back to Poland. Now, she was a lecturer at Southampton University. I mean, she wasn't just a worker, who was doing casual work in Britain. She felt her whole life had changed. And this is what's taking place. There is a reaction in society. It's not just that things are changing, capitalism is in decline, and we are gaining the understanding of what needs to be changed. Unfortunately, there's every kind of cross current at the moment, which is cutting across the idea that there should be class organization, that there's international solidarity. The examples we quote are absolutely marvelous, but we do have to face the fact that we have a backlash and we do face reaction. Now, how do we work? I'll just touch on some things. I think we have to continue as we have in terms of seeing solidarity, discussion, communication across national boundaries, I think is the first principle. to apply expertise in terms of our theory, in terms of our understanding, and to pass the best ideas that we have of science and of Marxism from one country to the other, from one group of people to the other. And then our practice to show what's needed. I think one of the things that Finn raised recently was the idea that maybe we should have a kind of a health international, to look at health services internationally. That's a critical question in Brazil. It's a question in India. It's a question in Britain. It's a question in every country in the world, really, but mostly of all in our own discussions. And maybe we need to focus on this and get the expertise, get the concrete ideas of what's needed, and actually see what we can do to be able to expand the context that we have and to deepen our understanding and to deepen and improve our practice. Just one last point. In the last couple of days, I've come to understand just how well organized the state is. The state makes many mistakes, but they're involving every single time we have a discussion. We say, well, we don't want cadres. We don't need all of that professionalism. The working class itself will just come to its feet. There are hundreds of thousands of experts who are working to destabilize any movement that we are making forward. It's terrifying, actually. Well, not terrifying. It really provokes me when I realize that actually, in many ways in South Africa, for instance, we made fools. CIA was very active. And all the movements, our movements were totally destabilized, if I look at it now. And we tell the truth about our own movements in South Africa. We have to talk about this destabilization and the way in which, they've been able to infiltrate and overturn our best efforts. But that does mean that we have to advance from theory to be able to form concrete organization in the most honest and open way so that we can face a state which is quite well organized against us and overthrow it. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for that contribution, in particular for warning us about the rise at the right. That's always to be kept before our minds. Just before they speak, there has not been a lot of discussion about the breakup of the UK. Roger has alluded to it, but there hasn't been much discussion about what might happen in Scotland, in the north of Ireland, or in Wales, for that matter, where the Labour vote went up. There hasn't been much reference to the monarchy. Roger says that the monarchy, or suggests it would disappear with or fade out with the death of Queen Elizabeth. There might be different views on that. The only reference so far was somebody mentioned the Queen's speech. Think about that concept, the Queen's speech. She doesn't speak, her speech is written, but she sees the Parliament, or the monarch sees the Parliament as her or his Parliament. So apart from that reference to the Queen's speech, perhaps a term we shouldn't use because it makes a concession to the monarchy. But no, it's only a small point, but there hasn't been much discussion about that. But there hasn't been discussion either, as I say, about the breakup of the UK, how that might develop in Scotland, North of Ireland, or even in Wales. So we have Dave Buxton, followed by Ed Bober, followed by Jimmy Kelly. The time probably is a bit more limited now. So if comers want to speak, could they put up the electronic signal on their profile then? Okay, Dave Buxton.
Okay, I want to say a few words about Britain and the role of trade unions. Quite often there's a big issue of a divide between the members and the leadership. And I think, to me, the recent election for General Secretary of Unison brought this into sharp focus. And now that was won by the right, but the right had control of Unison from its very inception a couple of decades ago when it was formed out of 3 old trade unions. So the balance of forces in terms of the unions and left and right didn't change when Unison re-elected, if you like, a right winger. But now we have the Unite election for the General Secretary coming up, and McCluskey, I think John mentioned his name, is definitely on the left. There's hardly going to be any union leader we could say we agree wholeheartedly with everything they do, but to have a left-leaning leader is really important. And I think we need to learn lessons from the Unison election where the left vote was split. And I've been to a couple of meetings, and I've said, well, if Coyne, the right winger standing for Unite, gets sufficient nominations that he is going to stand against the left, then I think we have to fall behind one of the left-wing candidates. And I don't really care which of those candidates, if it's a soft left one or if it's, as perceived, a harder left one. If we were to lose Unite as a left-leaning trade union, I think the whole movement could rapidly decline, because to have someone speaking about social and socialist issues from a trade union perspective and being an opposition to the Labour Party, as McCluskey has been from time to time, is a real fillip to the movement, that people have a sense of there being an alternative. And to some degree, I think that's exactly what we had with Corbyn. For I'd say a couple of decades in the Labour movement, socialism as a concept was sort of lost. You hardly ever heard it mentioned. But when Corbyn was elected, all of a sudden, you started to have that idea being discussed more and more. So I think it's, I agree with the comments that people said about Corbyn and the failure of Corbyn. And recently I heard, it was today actually, on the Labour Grassroots Zoom Sunday programme, there was a guy from Scotland, and he was previously a community organiser for the Labour Party in Scotland. And then when Starmer took over, they got rid of the community organisers. That's probably one of the first things they did. There were 2 community organisers for the whole of Scotland, and they got rid of them. So they don't believe, the Labour Party doesn't believe in building community organisations. And I think that's one of the tasks that the left have to be involved in, because particularly in those northern seats where the Labour Party, and I think this is part of John's analysis, that the Labour Party are just rested on their laurels. Oh, they've always voted Labour. We don't have to do very much work in these areas. In fact, they managed the cuts, and they're seen, the Labour Party is then seen as part of the problem. Well, you know, how are we going to change that unless we work with the communities? And I don't mean like the Liberal Democrats, because that's their model of, they would go on sort of rubbish collections and keeping the streets clean. I mean the things that really matter, like housing is a really massive issue in many parts of the country. And I don't want to make this about the housing issue, but in some areas, if you talked about housing, you'd just be swimming with the tide. But you'd have to get involved in community campaigns and explain, well, why are we in this situation? And then you could explain how the neoliberal capitalist model that's being followed means they'd rather have many, many thousands of units of accommodation being built, but sold to foreigners abroad. And they'll tell the working class, yeah, we've got targets to build 200,000 houses, but if 50,000 or 100,000 of those are being bought by foreign investors, what good is having a target? So there'd be so many opportunities if we got organised in a real sense in community issues. And I think in a certain, Matthew said that we need to have an alternative for Labour supporters, an alternative programme. And I think in some sense, that's what Corbyn did. There was a programme of things that were directed at the working class. But in Newham, where I come from, and Roger's in this constituency, we have our party, Labour Party, has been suspended, and so has the neighbouring constituency. So we've decided as a group to form the Newham Socialist Labour. So rather than sit back and be demoralised by the fact that the Labour Party bureaucracy has suspended us, and there's 5,000 members between the 2 constituencies, we're going through the process of building an organisation and a programme to put to the local working class on housing, on education, and a whole range of issues. And we're putting that out. And then we're going to try and build a whole layer of activists and go out on the streets and show Labour Party members what a socialist Labour Party could be. And the aim is that whenever the suspension can be lifted, and that could be a year, 2 years time, we'll go back into the Labour Party a lot stronger as a group of socialists than we came out. But I want to go back briefly to the trade unions and the bureaucracy. The problem also with the trade unions is a lack of a deep enough analysis of the bureaucracy, because in Unison, I think that they've had training from American trade unions, because the way they viciously attacked left-wing controlled branches, I can think of the example of 4 Socialist Party members where they were suspended from the union because they put out a leaflet which had certain details on it. It's completely trumped up. And these Socialist Party members, I think it took them 5 or 6 years to try to, they went through a court to try and get off these charges. And in the end, I think the majority of those suspended people, they left and joined Unite. And I myself went through a similar experience where when we took over our local Unison branch, then the bureaucracy of Unison put in a group of bureaucrats to run the union until they extracted us out of the union branch, which they did successfully over 3 years. Now, that's what the right wing does. But on the left side, with this election coming up for Unite, I think one of the questions we should ask the left-wing candidates, how do you see is the way forward for building trade unions that are self-sufficient at a local level and active, that they can lead fights against cuts, etc., on their own initiative, and they'll be supported by the bureaucracy? Because I think we need to put it the right way round. And whereas I've been at some of these meetings, the hustings meetings, and the only question that really they've raised in relation to the membership is like, how do you see the role of Unite Community, which is a bit of an offshoot of Unite? It's not like based on a workplace, but it's based on a layer of activists who aren't in any particular workplace. But I think we have to be hard about this issue about building a rank and file within trade unions, and let's see if any of those 3 left-wing candidates are able to give a cogent argument about how you build trade unions in the 21st century with all of the problems that we've been through with the working class. Then I think we would have a closer idea of who we'll be supporting in terms of left-wing leadership. So the other thing I think in terms of Britain and the left and win is, I think we have to put forward this idea of a party of the working class, because I agree the Labour Party is taken over by middle class do-gooders, and in terms of Labour working class representation in Parliament, it's dwindling to a mere handful of people. And we have to keep putting that to the fore until we have workers, a whole layer of workers within Parliament. Our interests are not going to be looked at. And if we say that to working class people, I think that would have an echo. And it would also, then the whole issue about, well, is the Labour Party the correct vehicle, is brought right into sharp focus. We're not saying leave the Labour Party and form a party of the working class. What we're saying is, if the Labour Party is a party of the working class, then it should have Labour representation through the core of the of all parts of the organisation, but particularly in Parliament. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Dave. That's an extremely important contribution in terms of the fight within the unions, and you fleshed out the arguments in relation to Unite, the need to build the rank and file movement, and the need to fight the bureaucracy forthrightly. Thank you also for explaining the programme and the plans for the new Labour Party, which is a very significant part of the struggle inside the British Labour Party at the moment. I'll take Ed Bober next. Okay, Ed.
Thanks, Finn. I just want to start with something concrete that I was canvassing for a socialist candidate in the local elections a couple of weeks ago. Came to a door, the member of the household not registered to vote, 27-year-old woman, never really had any concept of the point of voting,
And I told her that the Labour candidate in this particular ward was standing for a minimum wage of £9.50 per hour for everybody in the town in Morpeth. And she suddenly said, how can I vote? That I want to vote. And what to me illustrated that was the first time in this person's life that she had seen the relevance of voting. Prior to that, it had all been abstract discussion about stuff going on in Westminster that bore no relation whatsoever to her life. A class approach to politics, a concrete approach that shows people that their living standards can be improved, can make a huge difference in politicizing the generation that we are talking about in terms of the future of this society. Jeremy Corbyn captured a mood amongst young people that was a huge step forward in the political development within Britain. It was a transformation, because people, after years and years of Blairism on the so-called left, people suddenly realized that you could aspire to a more equal society. And I agree with the comrades that, you know, Corbyn himself as a figure he's fulfilled whatever he can in terms of development of the movement, and the next phase of the movement will be different. There are hundreds of thousands of people who've dropped away from the Labour Party, but it hasn't gone back. Political consciousness in Britain has not gone back to what it was prior to the Corbyn movement. Those people are aware that society is unjust. They were aware of that before, but they are also aware that it is possible to challenge the injustice of the unequal society that we live in, although there is a logjam now in finding a way to take that movement forward. But those people are waiting to become, hundreds of thousands of them are waiting to become activists again. I don't agree with David that, if I understood him correctly, that people now are better off than their parents. I think if you take my generation, we were definitely better off than our parents and grandparents who came through the First World War and the Second World War, terrible conditions and so on that they suffered. But my children and the entire generation of young people between the age of 30 and 40 at the moment have got lower living standards, less chances of stable employment. They have to work far harder, far longer hours to make ends meet, far less possibility of getting a home of their own and so on than we did. And if economic developments continue as they are, their children will be worse off than them. And now, John Dunn is right that Marxists are not soothsayers, that the IMT and the CWI developed this habit of very supposedly precise predictions of what was going to happen and so on. But Marxism does allow us to understand in broad terms what future developments are coming. And we know historically that one of the reasons capitalism in Europe and North America was able to maintain a degree of stability during most of the 20th century was because capitalism was capable of raising people's living standards, that it was capable, in conjunction with pressure from the trade unions, in conjunction with the exploitation of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, capitalism in Western Europe and North America raised the living standards of the majority of the population for a few generations. And because of that, it had a degree of political stability. And the the converse of that is that capitalism today, particularly since the 2008 financial crash, incapable of raising living standards, is also no longer capable of controlling the way the consciousness of the working class will develop in terms of looking for alternatives to capitalism. And if you look at the results of the recent by-election in Hartlepool, it's not the case that that Labour voters voted in a Conservative member of Parliament. It's not the case at all. If you do a breakdown of the votes, what you have is a massive collapse of the Labour votes because of Labour voters not going to the polls at all, and then combine UKIP voters with Tory voters, and you get the Tories winning the election. In 2017, Labour got 3 times the number of votes that it did in the election this year in Hartlepool. In 2019, Labour got twice the number of votes it did. In fact, in 2017, it was the only election where Labour's vote went up since 1997. So what we have is not a turning away from Labour to the Tories by large numbers of working class people. You have a collapse of the Labour vote because people don't see Labour in areas where the right wing dominate Labour. People don't see Labour as their party any longer. And in areas where the left were able to push their policies, as was the case in parts of Northumberland in the local elections, Labour votes went up. So we can see that there is a potential for the left to make gains in the coming period. Now, the future of the Labour Party, of course, is unknown. And I heed John's point, not that we shouldn't be soothsayers. There will be, at some point, there will be a huge explosion from the grassroots in this country. There'll be all the pent-up frustration of housing problems, difficulty getting jobs, difficulty getting stable employment, the way your boss treats you, all the hypocrisy of the ruling class and the pent-up anger of the work. It will come out on the streets. And what happened in Glasgow, of course, was just a little foretaste of that.